Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 3. This week, we're going to be unpacking and really exploring what ethics are in research. And as always, I like a good cartoon. I appreciate The Far Side. And I would say this is a what not to do for your research. And there will be a upload of the PowerPoint, so you'll be able to read the cartoon there. When we talk about ethics and ethical research, we really have to start with the researcher, which is the beginning of the research. So the term ethics derives from the Greek word ethos, meaning character. So this is where you engage with the ethical dimension of your research, and it really does require asking yourself several important questions. And I encourage you to do so and take some time to reflect on them, because as you step into the role of student researcher, this becomes an important piece, particularly in your methodology, but should also be informing your overall work that you're doing in the research you plan to do. So the questions are, what moral principles guide your research? How do ethical issues influence your selection of a research problem? How do ethical issues affect how you conduct your research, meaning the design of your study, your sampling procedure, and so on? What responsibility do you have towards your research participants? For example, do they need an informed consent to participate in your project? Spoiler alert, yes, they do in this program and for this class and senior project. What ethical dilemmas or issues might come into play in deciding what research findings you publish? Will your research directly benefit those who participated in the study? Shifting gears slightly, this is going to be an overview now of sort of the food and drug safety in the United States and in the early years, meaning where did this arise from? Where did we decide to have a governmental body help us determining what was safe for Americans to consume or put on their bodies or things like that? So essentially, in 1893, Harvey Washington Wiley, who was the chief chemist of the Bureau of Chemistry at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, became the main crusader of food standards. So this is when canning of foods began going into mass production. However, it wasn't always the safest of procedures. There was often a lot of botulism. There was also the high risk of botulism in home canning. So again, as factories started manufacturing canned goods for citizens of the United States, as other countries were doing, it was becoming more apparent as issues arose around poisoning or botulism or unsafe fillers that were being put into food to stretch out what was being put in the cans. So this was sort of the movement between towards getting the looking at food standards. One of the next significant pieces in history was the publication of Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle in 1906, which was absolutely a graphic novel that detailed the conditions of a Chicago meat packing plant and just utterly terrified and repulsed Americans as they read about the meat and how it was handled and processed and how it was coming to them, whether in a can or through their butcher, and just the lack of cleanliness, the horrible standards, and just multiple issues. So, out of this, again, there was this lobbying and push for getting a meat inspection law and a comprehensive food and drug law. Unsurprisingly, then, in 1906, President Roosevelt, the first one, Teddy Roosevelt, signed on the same day both the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act, which constituted in America the first federal regulations of food and drugs. In 1938, the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 passed. This law established quality standards for food, drugs, medical devices, and cosmetics manufactured and sold in the United States. And this also provided for federal oversight and enforcement of these standards. One of the reasons behind this act, particularly about medical devices, was that radium was all the rage in the late 20s, early 30s. And you could get radium belts to strap on yourself to give yourself a healthful glow, or use radium in cosmetics to look, bright and dewy. So, as we all know, radium is not a good thing. Going forward, we sort of now look at our very problematic and troubled history around biomedical ethics and where our research started and where it has led us. So, Levine, the quote I like here is the basic approach to the ethical conduct of research and approval of investigational drugs was born in scandal and reared in protectionism. And you can see this in a lot of the colonial, you know, era and the idea of privilege that pervaded much of our early research. I always like to name James Marlin Sims, who is considered the father of modern gynecology, but he conducted horrific and terrible experiments on enslaved Black women without consent, without anesthesia. And while out of that work came great advances, again, it's an incredibly problematic and troubled start to that work. One of the other big movements in America from the 1900s to the 1940s was the eugenics movement. And eugenics was incredibly popular across North America and Europe. It was really this idea that, again, rooted in privilege, colonialism, white power, that, you only wanted the best of the best, and clearly that was white people. And so the only way to make the white race stronger was to begin sterilizing undesirables. So that included, and again, these were all non-consensual sterilizations, primarily of women, but also men. So it was white people, minorities, anybody the state deemed unfit to reproduce, which included the poor, handicapped, the criminal, the uneducated. It was sort of, if you were not a white privileged person, you were deemed unfit by the eugenics movement. Continuing forward, we look into the late 1930s and the 1940s, specifically at Japan with Unit 731, which just did horrific, horrific, gruesome, brutal experiments on captured Chinese prisoners in the Japanese war against China, and continued partially through their start into World War II. We also have all of the well-publicized awful, awful experiments conducted by Mengele in the Nazi concentration camps. All of these became public during the Nuremberg trials in the late 40s after the war ended. And out of all of this, one of the biggest pieces that came, legislation piece globally was the Nuremberg Code. And this was in 1949. And it was truly an early attempt to specify ethical standards for research involving human participants. And also, started articulating human rights practices for people captured in war. But it was really focused specifically on research and that there needed to be informed consent and no coercion, that people were free to choose or stop at any time. And it was really codifying ethical guidelines for researchers who did research or work with human participants across the globe. Shifting back to America, we cannot ignore the Tuskegee syphilis study, and it is one of the most awful and outrageous examples of disregard for basic ethical principles of conduct. Again, so many violations of basic standards of, I would say, human decency as well as ethical research. And in 1976, the historian James Jones interviewed John Heller, who had been the director of the venereal diseases unit from the public health sector from 1943 and 1948. And again, the Tuskegee syphilis study started in the 30s prior to penicillin, which is actually the cure for syphilis or the treatment for syphilis, I should say. And that came about in the 40s. And he actually, if you don't know the history, Google mindfully, but he actually never gave these men who had syphilis the cure or any penicillin. So, and this is what he had to say. He said the men's status did not warrant ethical debate. They were subjects, not patients, clinical material, not sick people. So, and again, all of the participants were Black men who had families. And when the government finally did the investigation and ended it in 1972, so it had gone on for nearly 40 odd years here. The review panel found that the study was ethically unjustified and argued that penicillin should have been provided to the men. And out of this just become, so much damage, particularly for Black African American people in the United States, because they lost all trust in the medical profession, because there was absolutely no reason not to treat the men with syphilis with penicillin when it was available, but they did not, and they let them die horrible deaths and infect people in their communities and families. So the population was deceived into thinking they were receiving free medical care for the syphilis. So they were a vulnerable population who were eager for medical care and help. There was no informed consent. So there was at that time very much a blind trust in the medical community. Of course, you're going to help us. Treatment was withheld when it became available, which egregious. And there were so many issues around racism, classism, socioeconomic status, and gender issues. And of course, absolutely no informed consent to any of this treatment or experimentation. So a very long, dark, nasty shadow. Again, we'll shift focus here and look more at Europe and really look at the thalidomide tragedy that began in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Thalidomide was developed by a pharmaceutical company in Germany in the mid 50s, and it was found that as a sedative, it was super helpful to pregnant people to help them sleep and also to really alleviate morning sickness and nausea. And so it was approved and widely prescribed across Europe. However, the doctors were unaware that when the drug is given to pregnant people, it grossly interferes with how the fetus develops. And as you can see, here's one of the thalidomide babies who has the flippers instead of fully developed arms and hands and, legs and feet. And yet, the pharmaceutical company did not share this information with the doctors, kept sending out brochures and telling doctors to prescribe this. So again, an ethical breach of trust between the pharmaceutical company, the doctors and their patients. And again, the request for thalidomide then was growing in the United States. And while it was widely used in FDA, in Europe, excuse me, the FDA did not approve thalidomide in the US, and we were actually able to prevent a very huge major domestic tragedy. Yes, there were some thalidomide babies in America, parents or oftentimes men traveling to Europe had gotten the drug and brought it home to their pregnant wives and thus emerged a handful, but nowhere near the great numbers that happened in Europe. And really, the reason this didn't happen is this kick-ass woman, Frances Kelsey, who absolutely prevented the drug's approval within the US, even though there was so much pressure on her to approve the drug from the thalidomide's parent pharmaceutical company and her FDA supervisors. But she said that the application, and she demonstrated that the application for thalidomide contained incomplete and insufficient information on the drug's safety and efficacy. And mind you, this is now 1962. Thalidomide babies had been born starting in 1956. So there's now 6 years of data and information that is being absolutely suppressed, not researched and correlated. So she very much held that line despite all this pushback. In fact, she almost got fired as a hysterical woman for her stance on thalidomide. History, of course, has since proven her correct. And after the thalidomide tragedy and the information was emerging out of Europe that it was causing these terrible birth defects, and so many children were impacted, many of whom did die, that this is where the US now passed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act to ensure that there was rigorous and superior drug safety. I know that was a little wide-ranging looking at the food and drug, but it's important to understand the lineage and the historical constructs, right? That goes into why we really talk about ethics in our research today. Moving into more of the behavioral social sciences, which is also where we're framing some of the work in psychedelics, is we look at the Milgram experiments in 1963. So this was the call for deceiving volunteer subjects into thinking they were involved in an experiment on the impact of punishment on memory. So there was obedience to authority. And again, that really reflects back that an authority figure greatly influences people's behavior to an extreme extent. And you need to think about that as a researcher, because your participants are going to see you as an authority in your own work. The Milgram experiments also led to the APA Code of Ethics that was first created in 1963 and is subsequently updated at regular intervals, and again was updated following Zimbardo's 1973 prison experiments. The overarching timeline then essentially is the Nuremberg Code in 1949. It emerged out of the post-World War II atrocities. It named that informed consent is absolutely essential. Qualified researchers must use appropriate research designs. There must be a favorable risk-benefit ratio, and participants must be free to stop at any time. You can see all of these are part of the work we do now. So these truly were groundbreaking at the time, and they continue to be a foundational piece of the ethical work we do today. The Declaration of Helsinki came out of the World Medical Association meeting, the first meeting in 1964, where they began by talking about thalidomide, strangely. But you can see that the Declaration of Helsinki is updated regularly, most recently in October of 2024. And again, it's a global declaration that talks about the well-being of the subject should take precedence over the interests of science and society. Consent should be in writing. You need to be using caution if the participant is in a dependent relationship with the researcher. There's a limited use of placebo, especially if treatment is available. There's a greater access to the benefit once the research is concluded. So if there was a particular group that didn't necessarily have benefits during the research, they should, post the conclusion of the research, have access to that. They also highlighted the need to disseminate research results, including negative and inconclusive studies that came out in 2013. And the requirement for treatment and compensation for injuries related to research, also added in 2013. In addition, the updated versions are felt to be more relevant to limited resource settings, so specifically addressing the need to ensure access to an intervention if it is proven effective. We also have the National Research Act that was published or passed by Congress in 1974. As I said earlier, it came out of the revelations of the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1972, which just caused massive outcry over the immorality of the research, and I would argue the researchers. It was the first serious attempt in the United States to build a comprehensive ethical research practice. And out of this act, there was a national commission that was created to develop guidelines for human subjects research and to oversee and regulate the human experimentation in medicine. It is housed within the FDA, so when researchers are wanting to research new drugs or medical devices or things like that, there's a presentation to the committee who oversees all of this at the FDA. We also have in 1978 the Belmont Report, which is the U.S. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. Out of these guidelines, we developed respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. So here you can see sort of a timeline. This is now the Council for International Organizations of Medical Sciences, or CIOMS, and they also, taking the development from Nuremberg and Helsinki, Declaration of Helsinki and the Nuremberg Code, talk about informed consent, research in developing countries, protection of vulnerable populations, distributions of burdens and benefits, and roles and responsibilities of ethics committees. So they were really naming that the institutional review boards or the human rights review committees really are looking at the research with critical eyes to ensure the safety and well-being of the participants, as well as the ethical practice. And Potter Stewart has a good quote: ethics is knowing the difference between what you have a right to do and what is right to do. So our current ethical guidelines for human participant research is respect for persons. So this means we have the informed consent process, voluntary participation. Participants have the right to withdraw. They have the right to ask questions. And they also have the right to request the research or data after it is completed. There are also special protections for participants or vulnerable populations who are unable to fully comprehend the consent process. For example, small children. Small children cannot fully consent. They can assent to research, but usually a parent or guardian needs to sign off on the consent. Beneficence is the risk-benefit analysis that should be conducted to ensure that benefits outweigh risks. There are several types of risk to participants and their causes. Again, this is not fully comprehensive, but it is to help you start thinking. There's the physical risks, the psychological health risks, reputation, and social standing. So again, since we're looking at the field of psychedelics, if the substances and the practices are illegal, then there's the risk that the participant's reputation or social standing could be damaged if it was known that they participated in quote unquote illegal research or research with an illegal substance. And essentially, it is the researcher's responsibility to maintain participants' confidentiality and anonymity as requested. Justice, this means the fair selection of participants and also special considerations for groups that are easier to manipulate. Overall, the summary here is all codes and regulations advocate three fundamental principles: respect for persons, beneficence, and justice. Research, again, is a privilege and not a right, and absolutely the well-being of the participants is paramount. In qualitative research, the ethics are much the same, although since there isn't usually a scientific intervention, although there may be something else, but it's essentially the same types of ethical stances: do no harm, privacy and anonymity, confidentiality, informed consent, rapport and friendship, intrusiveness, and inappropriate behavior, data interpretation, and importantly, data ownership and rewards. If you're working with a marginalized or vulnerable population, and we are doing post-colonial research that advocates for all, does the researcher own the data or do the participants own the data? We also talk about assessment of benefits and risk when we look at ethics and we do research. When we talk about benefits and risk, we talk about risks or harms and benefits that may be physical, pain or injury, psychological, social, economic, or legal, etc., etc. Risks or benefits of research may apply to individual participants, families, groups, or organizations, communities, or nations. And the risks and benefits to the research participant usually carry the most weight. So again, thinking into the research you're planning to do, it's always good to let your participants know not only the risk, but what are the benefits? What are the positives? What may they get out of this, even if it's nothing more than the sense of having contributed to the research and the work? That's important. Name that. There's absolutely no justification for inhumane treatment of participants, and particularly not at the undergraduate research level. Risk to participants should always be reduced to the maximum extent possible. And if a significant risk is involved, justification of the research must be examined with particular care. Again, this isn't something we're focused necessarily at undergraduate research, but it is part of the general underlying principles of risk. And in particular, whenever vulnerable persons are participants, the need to involve them must be carefully demonstrated. Why are we looking at this particular population? What are the specifics? What are the benefits, aside from what are the risks? Again, research entails risk. No research is risk-free. Some of the risk can be anticipated, some risks can be mitigated, and some can be avoided. But overall, because it is research, we cannot anticipate all risks despite our best efforts. And I just want to say, the ends, the means, subjects, and objects, right? Be aware of the humanity in each person and treat persons as ends in themselves and never solely as the means to an end. And I just want to name vulnerable populations and highlight that, again, special populations, for example, could be the sick and desperate, a small subset of people with a very, very rare brain tumor who are desperate for a cure or some sort of life extending treatment. Children, adolescents, indigenous people, LGBT, trans, pregnant, marginalized, low income, unhoused, minority, etc., etc. All of these people can be seen as vulnerable populations. And all research participants are can be held as vulnerable because of the unknown. We don't know. There may be some hidden risks that we didn't know. There are two underpinning themes to keep in mind when you're thinking about the ethical and moral research, and that is the tension between the good of the many, so the general good, versus the good of the few, the individual interests. So you can see this in a history of medical research, where was the benefit of the many versus where it was the few. So again, holding that awareness. When we talk about trust in research, we talk about the assumption of the participant stance or vulnerability, the attitude of goodwill towards the trustor, and the voluntariness of the research. And trustworthy and the rigor of the study refers to the degree of confidence in data, interpretation, and methods used to ensure the quality of the study. So again, not just the data gathered, but how is it interpreted? How is it presented? And were the methods used of, good rigor and ethical standards to ensure that you got good data? And finally, I just want to touch on reporting ethics and reporting research, because this continues to be a huge challenging, piece. Witness the thalidomide issue around incomplete or suppressed data when the FDA was weighing allowing thalidomide into the United States. So were there errors in the reported data? So it's either if the primary issues, I should say, backing up here is in that we see in reporting research is that there are errors in the reported data. So either intended, how to lie with statistics, or unintended, right? And again, plagiarism, either intended or unintended. And again, part of the issue, and if you have read the replicability crisis, you can see where if we can't replicate the research, how do we know that it's actually good data that we're basing decisions on? And in this greater age of AI usage and, sort of the phantom and fantasy information and data, that's a little worrisome if AI is writing up the results. So, how do you avoid the accidental plagiarism in scientific writing? Well, you absolutely want to read the original source, you want to summarize in your own words, and you want to write using your own words and your voice. And one of the big scandals or big plagiarism issues was Diederik Stapel, a Dutch social psychologist who had falsified so much data in many, many, many of his published papers. He was so revered, had published so much, was a speaker globally on all of his work. And it turns out he plagiarized and falsified the data in almost all of his papers. It was a huge scientific scandal. So, yeah, don't do that. So, again, this has impacts, right? Because the discovery of the falsified data from Stapel was based on the non-replicability of his work. He was claiming all these amazing results, and yet no other research scientist could ever replicate his findings or the amazing results. So that's a huge red flag. And then the false data reports makes the general public skeptical of research despite the infrequent occurrence. But again, it ties into then a rising mistrust in the research that is being published. And of course, it has serious consequences of the plagiarism and ethical violations. So the reminder here is please, please, please craft and be mindful of doing ethical research in your work.